Welcome to this week's edition of the Vasey View. This week, I am delighted to be joined as a co-host by Aryeh Bourkoff, my friend, mentor, founder of LionTree, fresh from a deal with AT&T. LionTree, the global telecoms, media, and technology advisory boutique. As regular listeners know, the Vasey View takes a deep dive every 2 weeks into an area or topic where technology meets public policy. We look at individual country strategies like France, Holland, Estonia, Israel. We look at specific sectors like agritech and cybersecurity and what governments can do to support them. And we interview policymakers themselves, such as former Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Malcolm Turnbull. Today, I'm delighted to say our special guest will address the biggest public policy issue we all face, tackling climate change. Mark Carney is already well known as a highly successful and engaged governor of the Bank of England. And since leaving that post, he has become, among other things, the UK Prime Minister's finance advisor for COP26, the climate change summit being held in Glasgow at the end of this year, and the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. That rather wordy title can be translated, I think, as the person who wants to re-engineer financial investment to ensure the transition to net zero. In addition, amazingly, he's found time to publish a book, Values, Building a Better World for All, which in my view is nothing less than a comprehensive manifesto for governments and companies to navigate the digital world. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Ed. Great pleasure.
It's fantastic to have you on the podcast. And we really want to dive straight in talking about how we're going to re-engineer the financial system to help companies transition to net zero, because we all know that one of the biggest arguments used against moves towards net zero is how much it's going to cost. But people may have worked out from my podcast that I know very little about finance, whereas Aryeh Bourkoff knows an enormous amount. So I'm going to hand over to Aryeh just to kick off the conversation on financial re-engineering.
Well, thank you, Ed and Mark. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you on the podcast here and to re-engage with you virtually, and hope we get to see each other in person again, since we've last seen each other in London. I've been obviously a great admirer of your work as a fellow banker, but obviously in your case, you're the banker in the UK and doing much more important work on a macro scale, and now taking on even a bigger challenge. And really to get right to the heart of why you wrote this book and why now, I really want to just dive straight in, because your key goal in looking at the subject matter of the book is to really look and working to ensure that every financial decision takes climate change into account. And combating climate change is going to cost a heck of a lot of money. And so, because you used to be a banker and knowing how to look at things from that financial lens and have tremendous credibility in that regard, how do you look at that mountain to climb here and really look at how much money that's going to cost, and how do you really assess that, and give us a sense of how you wrote that book and why now?
Okay, well, great. It's great to see you again, Aryeh. And you've been busy since we last saw each other in person, so well done for that. And maybe we can dive into a bit of that later in the podcast. Look, I think the first thing, I'll say one word on the book and then get to the heart of the question, because they're very much related, as you said. Which is the book looks at the relationship between value in the market, and values of society, and draws out instances when those are aligned. In other words, value in the market is helping to deliver values in society, for example, sustainability, like solving climate change, and when they're in conflict, when values get undercut, and they actually undercut the functioning of the market, as we saw in the run-up to the financial crisis. And I give some detail on that. But let's go to the positive, which is what we're trying to do, is how do we align the financial sector to be part of the solution to solve climate change? How do we get to that point where every financial decision takes climate change into account? We need to do, I'll do three main things that we need to do. The first is we need to get the plumbing of the financial sector right. So a lot of very worthy and seemingly anodyne, but essential measures that need to be in place. Things like mandatory disclosure of climate risks and opportunities by companies. So not just what they're emitting today, but what the future holds for them if countries do what they claim they're going to do, which is to transition towards a net zero world on schedule for sub 2 degrees. What does that mean for a company's strategy, its business, its opportunities, that kind of disclosure? Secondly, so that investors and banks have the right tools to manage those risks, seize those opportunities. Think about climate risk management. Look, there's a lot of very techie issues around that, which maybe I'll spare the listeners from going in. We can attach the COP private finance strategy to the notes to this podcast if people want that. The third thing you need in this first bucket of plumbing is certain markets. There's some missing markets for carbon offsets. It's $100 billion a year market, or at least it should be. It's measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars at present because it's not a professional market, and that can be fixed. It is being fixed under the leadership of Bill Winters of Standard Chartered and 450 other organizations that are working hard to have this in place for COP. So you need this plumbing in place. The second thing you need is commitment from the institutions themselves, financial institutions, a commitment towards net zero. And just as a headline, I'll mention that 3 weeks ago at the Biden summit, we secured a commitment of banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and beyond around the world, the leading ones, particularly in the UK, I might underscore, but totaling up to $70 trillion of balance sheets, saying we're going to have net zero plans, and not just for 2050, but short-term, measurable, demonstrable plans to help companies decarbonize. And the third thing we need is climate policy. We need credible and predictable climate policy. So it matters not just that the UK says it's going to go down by 68% emissions by 2030 relative to 2005 levels, but that there are specific policies that move in that direction. So the commitments on offshore wind, for example, the commitments to have a moratorium on new internal combustion engines by 2030, a series of other measures that are part of the government's strategies. All of those come together, and what happens is the financial sector can see the future, which is the lower emissions future. There's credibility there. It has the information because of the plumbing, and it has the markets in which to act. And then it does what it does best. And you know this from your daily life. And apparently Ed doesn't know any of this because he says he doesn't understand finance. But Ed, here's the thing. What finance is really good at is pulling the future forward to the present if it has those conditions. And so this is all about creating those conditions. The good news is on all of those fronts, we're moving in the right direction.
Right. So let's go to the foundational aspects of all this first, which is getting the right data set in place. So one of the companies at LionTree that we've invested in is a company called Grow Intelligence, which is run by a woman named Sarah Menker, who it's an AI platform, which is basically creating the clean global data sets on climate. And it was recently nominated in the Time 100 most influential companies. And so what it does is basically trying to create the data sets around different elements of climate and almost trying to create almost a new asset class of the climate asset class, which you could almost go into being a impact asset class. So what role does like technology play in help to create those data sets in ameliorating this climate crisis? And what companies are leading the charge from your perspective, and which ones are kind of like falling short? And how do we get into like kind of that clean data set of the underpinning of the foundation of this marketplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a fundamental issue. So first thing is, what I said a moment ago is we need companies to do this standardized disclosure consistent around the world. And I do want to underscore the UK as G7 president, COP president, is leading the charge here. We're legislating. We're getting the accountants to do it through something called the IFRS. I'm going to throw another acronym. You know what it is. Most people won't. Don't worry, but it's a good thing. The US is headed in that direction. Big news out of the US on this. So the world's moving in this direction to get this overall. But there's more data, and it does need to be comparable, and it needs to be consistent. And so there's a series of companies that are competing to be the providers for that information. And I think what is needed, and you just gave an example, is clean data, consistent data, and providing one thing that I think investors, banks, financial market participants look for is what I would call a single company view. So where can I get not just my climate data on a company, but also broader sustainability data, so-called ESG data, so that I, as the decision maker, can and analyze that data, manipulate that data, and decide, make comparisons and make judgments around. And so there's some of the bigger players in the market, an IHS Market, Refinitiv, and others who work to provide those. Bloomberg, I guess, as well, provide that type of information. Crucially, with technology, though, we need a couple of other things. We need real-time monitoring technology, which from your world. Low Earth orbit, satellite technology, but also just the monitoring ability. So for a couple of things, one, I'll give a couple of practical examples. One is, if I buy an offset because somebody has planted a bunch of trees in Indonesia, and as those trees grow, they take carbon out of the air. Well, I need to know that those trees are still there next year after, et cetera, that somebody hasn't come back and cut them down. I need to do. I'm not going to fly to Indonesia all the time to see it, as nice as that would be. But I can get real-time, cheap monitoring of that. You can also use satellite technology to optimize nature-based solutions, not just reforestation, but agriculture and other solutions. So there's a real growth in that area, and there's great competition. Tracking methane, for example, one of the biggest challenges in the short term is reducing methane emissions from energy production, other production, has a big payback in the short term on climate change. Again, it can be targeted, monitored, and be clear. I'll throw out one other example, which is early stage, and you probably, I'm not going to flag a company that does it because it's early enough stage, but there are those who are trying, which is around tracking the carbon molecule through the supply chain. And attaching the carbon molecule through the supply chain, and or tracking the green electron through the power grid, so that you have in the second case, you are matching your production. You're buying a green electron for your production, and you're legitimately net zero on that case, or low emission on that case. In the first case, I'm tracking the molecule through the supply chain, which, by the way, could be done through some blockchain and other technology. This is one of the good applications of blockchain potentially. That helps me, as many of your clients, multinationals, tell their overall footprint, right? What's my overall footprint? Where can I optimize? How do I get it down? And incredibly and clearly and consistently, robustly communicate to all of their stakeholders, not just shareholders, but employees, communities, when they get to net zero, how they manage it down and get to net zero. So there's a huge technology element to this, really across the board.
Yeah, because ultimately what you're doing is the financial system, which you're rightly pointing out, is a measurement of sort of future economic health, right? And economic prosperity has to then match up with the impact system, or the future kind of overall just health, or climate change is a measurement of impact and health. And that bridge has to be kind of narrowed, that chasm has to be narrowed. And that may be a holistic exercise, but within that holistic exercise, there's certain elements like, technology or financial markets, or, certain, industries that could probably be more acute at kind of like bringing those two things together beyond just the overall ecosystem. So you can do it one by one, or you can do it holistically. And so you're saying like the banking system and the financial system can lead the way, the technology system can lead the way, or sometimes more, and obviously the carbon ecosystem could lead the way, whereas maybe more of a classic industry in the financial system may be kind of like last to kind of like make that leap. But ultimately, the overall financial markets may be turned on its head, and you may have a whole different asset class in the future, which is kind of putting climate at the forefront, not the traditional financial system.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that, Aryeh, because this is a crucial point, which is, and so one of the questions is going to be whether we have a new asset class, or whether we just have, this is a major thing, a new vector of value, a new determinant of value, which is, you look at every asset, not just some, not just in the energy sector or the steel sector, but every asset, and say, are you carbon competitive? Are you in a position where you're going to be on this path to net zero? And the critical thing, and this is where we need a combination of technology, information, judgment, right? Some of that judgment will be algorithmic, but a lot of it still will be actual judgment about which companies can I back with capital. They might be high emission today, they might be an outlier today, but they're they're going to become, I'll use the term carbon competitive tomorrow. And actually, we're going to capture a bunch of value because the market hasn't been looking at it that way. And that's what makes it so exciting. And it's part of what makes it a huge commercial opportunity. It's not just the scale of investment, although that's enough, but actually the whole market, or virtually the whole market, has not been looked at through this lens. It now is beginning to be done so. And there's just going to be huge dispersion in terms of valuations to begin with. Hence opportunity to make a lot of money and lose a lot of money if you're caught on the wrong side.
Right. So just to make it investable for 1 second. So like for those people out there that are not looking at this as a sort of like feel-good exercise or a compliant exercise, when you think about ESG, so which ESG assets actually create shareholder value in your mind, Mark, like today?
Well, look, I think there's a fair bit of evidence, it's not always if I buy an ESG fund that this is the case, but there's a fair bit of evidence of divine coincidence. I put it that way, where you get better ESG performance and you're outperforming the broader market, and that's for a few reasons, right? One is you're often screening out bad actors that go along for a while and then they're subject to a crisis. So you're just cutting off that left tail of bad performance. Secondly, if you've got a sense of purpose and you're broadly moving in that direction, you've got suppliers online, you've got employees online, your community is broadly supported, people know what you're about, you tend to score higher on ESG, and actually you tend to perform better because there is that alignment of all these drivers. And then there's a basic thing which I think management, in my experience, management that think about these big structural changes. Look, you see a lot in the media, you see on AI, machine learning, the intersection of these. Climate is another structural rewiring, if you will, of the economy. Those management teams that think about these issues tend to be more oriented towards them. Well, they tend to be better managers, and therefore they outperform in terms of other things. It's not 100%, of course, nothing ever is. But you have those broad alignment, and the key is to learn through the ESG data that you can have. Okay, which are the metrics that indicate that, and supplement that actually with good old-fashioned engagement with with the people that are running these organizations.
Exactly. Sorry, Ed, I'm only a guest on your VZV.
No, you're a co-host for the purpose of this podcast. You're a co-host, but I just wanted to. I mean, what fascinates me about the discussion you guys have just had is that traditionally when you think about climate change, and you particularly think about technology, you think about technology, solar power, to put it crudely. You don't think about. I think the change is monitoring. That monitoring technology is going to become one of the most important drivers towards climate change. And I was thinking about short-term versus long-term, because as an investor, you still tend to think in short-term mode, and how am I going to make the most money this year from investing in these companies? What is the incentive to invest in a company even if it's on a downward trend? And I wondered whether, as part of the kind of monitoring technology that is now becoming prevalent, this is going to drive public policy. So I was thinking, for example, about this idea of having carbon tariffs, that when you import and you can track that you've tracked the carbon molecule of the goods you've imported, you could potentially impose a carbon tariff, which obviously acts as an incentive, but it could also be protectionism by the back door. I mean, I wonder, Mark, how you felt that kind of nexus between this monitoring technology and public policy is going to develop.
Well, you've put your finger right at the heart of one of the issues around what are called carbon border adjustments. People may hear that term. They're going to hear it more frequently. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is something that's being considered by the European Union. The Biden administration has talked about them in similar terms. So it's basically, as you said, a carbon tariff. Now, if you're going to have a carbon tariff, I mean, let's say we've decided we're going to have a carbon tariff, and let's say it's for the steel industry, because it really matters the extent to which it's quite expensive to be less carbon intensive, and others could free ride on our efforts. That's the fundamental issue. But how do I measure the efforts that they're making? Okay. Is it the easiest way to do that is, well, if I have a carbon price and they have a carbon price, is there a big difference between the two? Okay, fine. US, for example, doesn't have a carbon price, doesn't necessarily have a prospect of having a carbon price, but is thinking about doing this going forward. So then you have to measure, well, what are the other regulations that this country has relative to my regulations, and try to somehow compare their fuel standards, their maybe product standards, or the electricity grid, all these elements, and add them together and see whether there's a big enough difference between the two that would justify this carbon tariff. All of this is in a world where I'm not being protectionist, which is part of your challenge, right? This is a world where I'm just trying to equalize carbon. That's quite tough to do. And can be challenged at the WTO and other things. However, in your question, what you were saying is, well, what if I just measure actually the green molecules or the brown molecules or the combination of those, and I can do that reliably through monitoring. So I'm comparing product standards, delivered steel into the UK, and the carbon footprint relative to that produced here, and it's reliably monitored. Well, then it becomes a product standard question, and can have the same result in terms of leveling up ambition, and can be fair and more transparent. And I think, this is just my personal view, because I don't work on this, but this will be a big part of the policy conversation for the next few years, this tariffs versus product standards. And then the ideal, and just to come back to it, the ideal, of course, is that in Glasgow, we're going to have a high ambition COP. Countries will all be making big efforts, and this will be more of a theoretical discussion, because you don't need these tariffs if everybody's moving in the same direction, which is what we very much intend to be the case.
You also, Mark, I noticed you launched this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is another acronym. It's GFANZ.
GFANZ, yes. Yeah, I like your pronunciation, Aryeh.
Thank you. Right, thank you. So it brings together 160 firms, which together, and just for everyone note this, 160 firms with assets totaling in excess of $70 trillion to accelerate the transition to net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. So tell us how that's going to work. People say, I herd cats for a living, and doing deals, but that's truly an extraordinary number, and certainly have a certain ballast to work from, with a great goal in mind, right around the corner. So how's it all going to work?
Yeah, so it is a big deal, and we've got 6 months, a little less than 6 months till Glasgow, and we're going to make it a bigger deal by Glasgow. That's the intention, is to grow GFANZ further across all asset classes. In effect, what these whether they're a bank, insurance company, pension fund, what they're saying is, okay, net zero by 2050, fine. Who's going to be around by 20? But that's the objective. That's all our objective. A target for 2030. The fair share, so the people that they invest in or lend to, that they will have reduced emissions consistent with a fair share of the 50% reduction that the world needs to do between now and 2030, and more in some in some countries than others. So that fair share, so mapping that out and having that contribution and clearly doing that, but also short term, for example, within the case of the banks, within 18 months, putting out specific decarbonization strategies for all the main sectors, so the telecom media sector, the steel sector we were talking about, et cetera, and all the way through. And of course, the point is, which goes back to partly technology and reporting, but really about goal, which is carbon reduction, is that they're companies that are part of the solution, so that they can undertake the big investments that are required to decarbonize. I'll just make one point. The 70 trillion is a big number. It sounds like a big number. It really is. That. But there are some other big numbers around the scale of investment needed. And just this week, the International Energy Agency was saying, in effect, if we want to get to 1.5 degrees, we need to double the amount of energy investment every year that we're currently doing. And that brings it from around $2.5 trillion a year, another big number, to 5 trillion a year. So it just gives a sense that we need big numbers in order for this to move and have that alignment. And what GFANZ does, apart from just the commitment and these firms working together and getting this plumbing and other aspects right, is it will be very transparent in terms of what their strategies are, where they're moving, and how much progress they're making.
You wonder if it takes everyone to be working together on this, right? So you wonder if why we're spending so much time focusing on going to space, between Elon Musk and obviously SpaceX and Amazon, et cetera, where we could just be focusing and targeting this one issue altogether here on Earth. Until we solve this, we should probably.
Well, I mean, you don't want to subscribe to the other side of Elon Musk, with all due respect to him, which is that, his effort to go to Mars, because, if things don't work out here on the planet, we'll exile.
Yeah.
But there is one ancillary benefit of that competition between Blue Origin and SpaceX and Telesat in Canada and others for these low Earth orbit satellites, is it makes that real-time monitoring very cheap, very effective, and it helps with the climate process.
Yeah.
In your view, Mark, is it going to be more? Are we going to have more impact with technology in terms of things like carbon capture or whatever, or in terms of conservation, in terms of not chopping things down?
Yeah, in my view, both. First thing on climate, everything matters. So it's seldom an either or. It's hugely important not to chop more things down. It's hugely important to reforest and increase biodiversity, and for carbon and for other reasons. And the UK is rightly pushing that. The Chinese are pushing that as well. But from what I've seen, and I'm not the engineer in the conversation, somebody put up their hands if they are the engineer in the conversation. We have to admit. Okay.
My father.
What I've seen, telling you a very wide range of technologists and engineers, is that even in there's virtually no net zero scenario that in 2050 does not require some degree of carbon capture at equilibrium at that point. So there still are some residual emissions. Some of them come from agriculture. Some of them come from things like plastics and petrochemicals, in the example of the IEA. We can debate whether it should be that, but so there is a need ultimately to have scalable carbon capture. And so it is very important, not just carbon capture and storage, but direct air capture of carbon. And there's very promising technologies on that, but those technologies are not yet economic. And it depends on your risk tolerance. If you're a VC growth investor, you see huge opportunity. If you're, don't believe in technology, you say, well, it's a council of despair and it won't happen. I'm more on that side of it. Last point I'll make is that one of the advantages of the increasing clarity we have about company plans and sector plans and what needs to be done, what's economic today, and what needs to happen, is if you're investing, if you want to help solve this problem, you can see what needs to be done.
Yeah,
we need to shift green hydrogen from just off of being economic to becoming economic. We need sustainable aviation fuels. We need direct air capture. We need a few other things. And the entrepreneurs and the innovators and the investors are starting to go after those areas which have received very little money up until now.
I was intrigued by what Aryeh said about the Musk Bezos row, because I did a podcast on agritech, and if there was an Elon Musk leading the fight to kind of have lab-grown meat and plant-based agriculture, we'd probably have a massive accelerated impact on climate change.
Yeah, although what we've had is the demonstration of Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat and others that have shown that the impossible is possible, and therefore more capital is flowing in.
Yeah. By the way, I noticed also one really exciting idea in the book that I was intrigued by, which is the ultimate sort of technology direct-to-consumer world. You have these global platforms like Amazon, that then become a platform for free trade, which is your idea. It could be free trade for the SME market, which as an acronym is the small, medium-sized enterprises, or the small, medium-sized businesses. So once you have these kind of blanket platforms, which you say 70 trillion is a big number, it also is not that big when you think of Amazon as 1.6, $1.7 trillion company. Very quickly can become these global platforms, and then they themselves can be new kind of governments of trade, right? And then new ecosystems. As a banker in the private industry and the public industry that you've experienced very successfully, how do you think about these new platforms? Because you put that idea out there, and what do you mean by that? I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think it's important. Just for those listening, unless they're alarmed, we are not suggesting that Amazon become a government of anywhere.
Sorry.
Just so
You never know; it could be the next big thing.
Oh dear.
In size and scope. And
that's taking the everything store a little too far. But no, but the idea. So part of the genesis of the idea, which is that we've had trade deals, free trade deals, which largely are geared to and helped negotiated by large multinational corporations, right? They're those types of supply chains. But now we're moving in a world where it is increasingly easy to produce, to ship something anywhere, to produce something or broadcast. Again, going back to one of your areas, Aryeh, broadcast anywhere through YouTube and other media. And so why aren't we focused more, and why shouldn't we focus more on making that process as seamless as possible for our small businesses, for growth reasons, but also for, use the phrase of the moment, leveling up reasons, and for political economy reasons, support for broader trade. Now, what do you need for that? Well, first, you need a platform that's efficient. Secondly, and one of the points I go into more detail in the book is around, well, you need a financing mechanism for those SMEs, because increasingly those small businesses don't have hard assets. Their assets are really intangible, but of course there's a lot of information about them, about their financeability, just in terms of traffic that drives through to their sites, the speed with which they pay, the social media footprint and others. And there are a number of companies now developing that use those footprints as better predictors of their creditworthiness and are willing to help fund them earlier. So using, again, but I believe in competition. I think we all do. You want to have a system where if we had a small business and we were on, whether it's Amazon or Shopify or whatever platform we're selling in, that we'd be able to take, again, I'm going back to data, our data file, including our footprint, our social footprint on that platform, and maybe go to Lloyd's Bank or some other capital provider in order to have the competition for that. So it's a supportive tax environment for entrepreneurs. It's a supportive financing environment which takes advantage of data, in particular data that can be harvested from that platform, that also makes it competitive. And ideally, what it is between like-minded countries is to say, look, at a certain threshold, we are going to rely on each other's rules and regulations, certain size threshold for the company that's on the platform. We're going to rely on our product standards, mutual product standards, and then you cut out a bunch of the red tape and other non-tariff barriers that often restrict that type of commerce.
I mean, do you think the politicians are sort of catching up with the consumers? Because I think, Aryeh's point is, we're used to kind of, in theory, buying anything from anywhere on a global platform, Amazon, but there are other platforms you can use. And yet there are still all these rules and red tape. And I think, the point about your book is that you go well beyond climate change to talk about effectively how digital and technology is going to change public policy, which is why I loved it. And I love your point about SMEs having a social media footprint. So you talked earlier in the podcast about how we're going to have to change financial reporting standards to take into account climate change, but we're also going to have to change, in a sense, how we value companies and how they report based on a whole host of technology innovations that weren't around 10 years ago.
Yeah, and whether it's how they report or how they, how I as an investor or a financier,
how you value them,
how I value them, and what information they can give me and give you at the same time. So in other words, what we don't want is a system where I, as the platform provider, have an absolute lock forevermore on that data and information, so that it's my platform. He can't go to your platform, or she can't go to your platform and get financed because I own all the information. By the way, sorry not to be too techie, but this isn't that techie, but I should own the algorithm. In other words, what I've learned from all of those businesses on my platform in terms of who's likely to be creditworthy and who's not. Just like 30 years ago as a banker, if I'd been a banker for 30 years, I would have accumulated some wisdom and knowledge. And if I went to another bank, I'm allowed to take that wisdom, knowledge, judgment, if you follow the analogy.
We've got to start a business.
Well, that's actually my question. My question, Mark, Mark, you have like, I have like so much respect for Mark because, we have assets in the UK, and I was watching Mark deftly navigate the immediate environment post Brexit, like just in such a perfect way in a chaotic period of time. Obviously, we're probably still navigating in a lot of ways, but like at that moment, it was frenetic and like such a steady hand at play with because of Mark Carney. And but I've seen him in action so many different ways. But now you have a lot of affiliations, which are very powerful and interesting, not just with the book, but you have Stripe and Brookfield and the UN. Now you have your media platform and your media guru. But obviously you have the government and you have banking. What platform for you, and I view you as one of the most respected leaders and doers of our time now, what platform for you is the platform that's ideal for you to sit atop of to be most impactful of executing this vision?
Wow, that's it's very kind of you to say. I would say at this point in time, the platform that I have that's most impactful is that very long paragraph of the title that Ed said at the start. And Ed, you're absolutely right. Normally, a single word.
Can you remember it, Mark, without prompting?
It starts with special. That's all I can remember. Special envoy, something. But yeah, governor was easier to remember. But at this point in time, that platform, because of this moment in time, the focus of the private sector, focus of Prime Minister UN and coming towards COP, probably is the most impactful. But this is a moment in time, and I don't know. I'm glad you said, Aryeh, I have a media platform. Coming from you is high praise. The only one I have is courtesy of Ed, actually.
Well, I met those Stripe kids. I met those Stripe kids 10 years ago when I was a minister. They came in, these two Irish kids, wet behind the ears. I should have just resigned on the spot, ripped off my tie and said, take me back to San Francisco.
Yes.
The great thing is that I now know that I'm worth more than Aryeh Bourkoff because I've got many thousands more Twitter followers. And if you value me on my basis of my social media profile, Aryeh, frankly, I leave you in the dust. But we are tied because you're not on Twitter. That's why I chose.
I try not to enter the game.
But we talked a lot about billion-dollar companies. But the point you make very clearly in your book, Mark, is, and it's a point that others are making as well, which is that COVID has removed the buffers for digital transformation. And on one level, that's extremely exciting. People are accelerating into change. But at the other level, it's also very concerning because it's called the fourth industrial revolution. It's a bit of a boring cliche, but the point about every industrial revolution is it leaves people behind, and normally it moves at a pace where the people who get left behind get pulled back up as the economy adjusts and the new technologies come on stream. Are you worried that the pace of change is so unprecedented compared to previous industrial revolutions that people who are left behind will have no way of pulling themselves back up? How should governments kind of address this?
Yeah, and the short answer is yes, I am worried about that, and I think you framed it well, which is that it would have been a worry going into COVID, and then it's been accelerated. This pace of change has been accelerated, including in ways not to be. This is both positive and negative. So one of the things I think we all reflect on is the ability to, for many of our roles, and certainly big elements of the roles the three of us have, our ability to do them remotely. And by the way, I remember the Collinson brothers, the two founders of Stripe. But 3 years ago, they set up a new branch, which was called Remote. And it was quite a radical idea. I mean, think of it, that being radical 3 years ago, the idea that you would just have people working anywhere in the world.
Oh, really?
Stripe, yeah. Now, of course, it's entirely natural. I mean, that's what all of us have been sort of doing. So as we touch wood, as we emerge, as and when we properly fully emerge from COVID, there's a UK-wide question of how we can facilitate and level up and spread wide range of activities on the service side across the economy. Now, that's good. That would level up from the Southeast. On the other hand, if that is spread out globally, all of a sudden, and there's lots of people who could do lots of things that I used to do in the past when I was a young investment banker, could do much better in other jurisdictions and much more cheaply, then you have this downward pressure on wage technology facilitating downward pressure on certain wages and pushing up inequality. Now, to accelerate into what you're saying, what you're asking about is, yes, what we do see in every time you've had big series of technological change is an increase in inequality. Those who have the skills and capital benefit initially, and then eventually it's spread more broadly, but eventually normally takes decades, and decades are a long time, and they're a long time when you start from a position of relatively high inequality, and having had the shocks that we've had in the last decade or so. So what can we do? And the book goes through some of this, makes the observation that every time we had one of these in the past, we end up revamping and upping our game on educational institutions, going from universal primary to quasi-universal tertiary. So institutionalizing mid-career training being part of it, and you need to integrate that with the social welfare system. This recognition that we need to do what we can, what we talked about a moment ago, or I don't know if it's a recognition yet, but the more we can use technology to empower small business, entrepreneur, broader, I mean, mass, I can say this two ways. I can say it as mass entrepreneurialism or sort of a mass artisan type economy, but both of those lead to a greater spreading of the benefits of technology across. Fortunately, I would say that the sustainable, what we need to do to move towards net zero, what we were talking about a moment ago, that tends to be more job heavy and more investment heavy and local as opposed to global. So that leans in the other direction of some of those digital changes. But certainly, just to summarize, big changes on the training side, on the education side related to that, backed up by social welfare. And then I would advocate, and I do try to advocate in the book, that we put a focus on the upside of these changes, where the opportunity set comes for new businesses, and how a new business, you can be in Sheffield and sell into Shanghai or Saskatoon. You might get more orders from Shanghai than Saskatoon, I guess, but you still can stay in Sheffield. And if we have the ecosystem there, including a financial system that works for that, we have a greater chance of not facing the pressures that we've seen.
You praise coming back full circle, where you praise AT&T in the book for investing $1 billion in reskilling their workers. And it's very counterintuitive, because mostly when you talk about business, sitting around a board table, you're talking about what technology are we going to invest in, not are we going. The idea of a paternalistic company, I thought, had gone out the window, but clearly there's an opportunity there.
It was partly, and this was about 5 years ago, but partly they were looking at, they were going to need to let a lot of people go and then hire a lot of new people in. And the question, and it was a tight labor market, the question is, well, how many of those people could they retrain and retain? I mean, it sounds very obvious, but they did it. But also from a broader, there was an element of responsibility for those who would come out. I mean, there's another big company, very successful financial institution called Allianz, based out of Germany. And one of their points is they guarantee employability, not employment, right? So they guarantee that they're continuing to build skills that people would have transferable as they shift the number of people that they have. I'll say one other thing, which I try to bring out, which is on this question. We are still, in most advanced economies, it is much more, we're tax advantaged to invest in ICT and information technology in capital relative to investing in people. Exactly. I can't capitalize that. I don't get the benefit. And that's something we really do, I think, need to tackle.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to hop about now. So I want to ask you while you're on, because obviously you started the conversation at the Bank of England about digital currencies. And obviously, despite being extremely wealthy myself, I've just seen my enormous Bitcoin holding go down by 30% because the Chinese government has clearly decided that Bitcoin has to be pushed out the way as it launches its own digital currency. But is there a chance now for Boris Johnson to dominate global financial markets by launching the Carney, the Bank of England's digital currency? Do you think Biden's going to do that? I mean, I barely understand what a digital currency is, to be honest, but are we going to get them sponsored by governments?
The first thing is a Bitcoin. I think the
oh, yes, Bitcoin.
the chancellor has already nailed it in terms of the name with a tweet. So he's on your medium on Twitter. Aryeh may not have seen that because he's not on Twitter.
They get sent to me by Ed.
I think the short answer is yes. I think that there will be central bank digital currencies. Bank of England, the Fed, ECB, other major central banks. It may take a few years, but they're certainly working hard on that. And I think it's going to happen for several reasons. One is, I mean, cash it's not totally going to disappear, but it's disappearing. Secondly, that there is some positive, also some negative innovation going on with private digital currencies and stable coins and other things. And what we can't have, the history of money, and the book goes through some of the history of money. I couldn't help myself, went through it, but is that any good innovation from the private sector in terms of money is ultimately appropriated by the state through the central bank, because the core of the system has to be credible and trusted and rock solid. And the bottom line, and it's not just Bitcoin, but these stable coins and other things, they are not there for eternity. There are issues with them. There's sometimes huge issues, sometimes smaller issues, but smaller issues that become big issues under stress. And so you can't have them at the core. They may play some roles, just to be clear, and again, this may be too techy, but there are roles for what are called native currencies in smart contract networks and some wholesale finance opportunities. And so you see a lot of activity around that based off of Ethereum or Ripple, other currencies like that. And they may well have a role, but at the core of the system, my judgment, you would build out from a central bank digital currency. And that it creates a lot of opportunities. It creates an opportunity for more competition, by the way, in the system as a whole. And I would expect, no guarantees, and others will make the decision, that the UK will be, if not at the forefront, very close to the forefront in terms of developing this to the benefit of, and this will help unlock some of the things we were talking about a bit before in terms of making a better environment for small business as well.
But it's a big geopolitical issue. China sees it as an opportunity to kind of take on the dollar.
Well, I think that China to some extent, very quickly, it backed into this because their private companies, Alibaba and we developed their own currencies, or effectively did. And then what we've seen is that being pulled back into the state, kind of proving my point from before. First point. Second point is that there are broader forces that lead to the renminbi potentially becoming the reserve currency over time, size of the Chinese economy. But very importantly, what happened when the UK stopped being the reserve currency, it took a lot longer than people thought it would be when it gave up and it became the US dollar. But what happens first is that people start pricing transactions in that currency. And so what's incredibly important is, in a world that's moving towards digital, is, well, what currency is being used to price transactions in terms of digital? Now, it's not the renminbi today. It could be, as you get the spread of the Chinese tech companies and social media companies, could be. Although if the US, the UK, the ECB move in parallel, it's just as likely to be a mix of those that we'll all be familiar with, albeit at a lower cost. And I'll make one point that isn't as obvious, and I should stop here, which is that this will mean, quite big enough savings for merchants that get passed on to consumers that it's noticeable if we do it right.
Interesting.
So Aryeh is speechless. I mean, this is very exciting stuff. I want to now lower the tone because, Mark, you've slightly, your range is so wide that you could be a politician. And you, by the way, have full editorial control over this podcast. This is not a gotcha podcast. But if you were a politician and we were doing this, I would obviously ask you the 3 things you've done to lower your carbon footprint. And you don't have to answer, and we can edit it out of the podcast. But if you've got good answers, now's your chance.
Now's my chance for the 3 things I've done.
As the COP26 finance king.
I was going to say, well, I've restricted all my flying.
Oh yes, very good. I've followed your lead.
No, well, we our car is 100% electric, so that's the first thing.
Good. That's the first trap for any politician. They arrive at the environmental interview in a diesel car, so you've avoided that.
Okay, so avoided that. Although I will say that when we got to the UK, just as a parenthesis, 7-8 years ago, the recommendation for lower environmental footprint was before the Dieselgate, and so we ended up with a diesel car that sounded like a good idea at the time, but was not, as it turned out. Anyway, so electricity to our home. Sorry, not electricity. Sorry, green electricity to our home. And then diet has shifted quite substantially away from forms of meat. It's not exclusively vegetarian / vegan. I will admit that is driven more by other members of the household, but that has lowered my carbon footprint alongside.
I was so scared and nervous doing this podcast that I forgot to kind of tee up the kind of soft questions at the beginning. So now, obviously, and all the people who are listening to this podcast while they're jogging and trying to work out the financial technical standards that you've been talking about would obviously want me to ask as well, your favorite moment of being governor of the Bank of England. What was the bit you liked best? I have to say, I shouldn't say this because it shows me in a bad light, but when I moved to the House of Lords, I made a resolution because when I arrived in the House of Commons, I kind of was already a bit of a media tart and all of this, and I didn't do the kind of groundwork. So I turned over a new leaf when I got to the House of Lords, and I worked incredibly hard, and I make sure I say hello to everyone when I walk through the door. But it helps that every time I say hello to someone, they say, "Good morning, my lord," and I think that's just great. I'm trying to get a laugh out of Aryeh here, but what was your favorite bit, apart from the pink tailcoats? What was your favorite bit at the Bank of England?
My favorite bit of the Bank of England? It's a great question. I liked it all. It was, there were hard days, but no bad days. Let's put it that way. I'm just trying to think of a specific example, because what I really liked was, and this is not a politician answer. Okay, this is. It's honest.
It's an honest answer.
Well, it's I haven't thought it through.
Okay.
I haven't focus group tested it, but when we go around do regional visits, always like the regional visits. I particularly like going up to sort of Humberside, Teesside, just because of the mix of it's doing better, but it's had a tough run over the decades in relative terms. It's part of the next economy because of the wind and other aspects. The people are fun, and I like the questions I used to get at the schools and be asked about. I'll just tell you very quickly. So I'd be asked about what kind of car I drove, just like you. They asked the same question. Do I own any Bitcoin? That was another question. What football team?
That is a good question, actually.
Yeah, and but there was a brewery, and I can't quite remember the name of the brewery. This is terrible. Just outside of Newcastle, but I can remember the product, which was it was a 6-pack of ales called the Northern Powerhouse, and they started at 4% alcohol per volume and went up by 2 percentage points each one.
I love it.
Now
that's George Osborne's. That's his legacy. The Northern Powerhouse. These days,
they would ask you if you own any Dogecoins.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to say I don't. Now I'm going to get a lot of hate because of that. You see, that's what we got to edit out there.
Yeah,
crypto bros get
very concerned. Aryeh, last word to you.
No, I think that like you said, you asked Mark about what his own personal efforts are to reduce carbon, but I think that while those are fun for the podcast, matching his skill sets, which are based in finance and global impact, with what he said about values in the book, I like he could eat all the meat he wants and he could drive all
very
the
good
cars
point.
he wants. If he could match his skill sets to the global financial markets and fixing climate for all of us to follow with $70+ trillion by 2050, which I hope we'll all be around for, by the way. That is the best use of matching that optimization of his mind to global impact, and his personal patterns aside. Like, that's what I'm most focused on. The fact that he does both is enviable and noble. But I really am really impressed with the global plight that he's taking on near term. And then I hope after that, if you don't have a platform beyond that, we're going to create one for you. And I have an idea already for that. So I really appreciate it.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Aryeh is always doing deals. Fantastic.
That's fantastic. I'm going to have a steak tonight after that.
You deserve it. Have two. Mark, you've been brilliant. Thank you, Aryeh, my guest and co-host, and Mark Carney for coming on this podcast. Very grateful.